Introduction to The Spirit of the Border. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leonard Wilson. The Spirit of the Border, a romance of the early settlers in the Ohio Valley, by Zane Grey, 1906. To my brother, with many fond recollections of days spent in the solitude of the forests, where only can be satisfied that wild fever of freedom of which this book tells, where to hear the whir of a wild duck in his rapid flight is joy, where the quiet of an autumn afternoon swells the heart, and where one may watch the fragrant wood smoke curl from the campfire, and see the stars peep over dark wooded hills as twilight deepens, and know a happiness that dwells in the wilderness alone. Introduction. The author does not intend to apologize for what many readers may call the brutality of the story, but rather to explain that its wild spirit is true to the life of the western border as it was known only a little more than 100 years ago. The writer is the fortunate possessor of historical material of undoubted truth and interest. It is the long-lost journal of Colonel Ebenezer Zane, one of the most prominent of the hunter pioneers who labored in the settlement of the western country. The story of that tragic period deserves a higher place in historical literature than it has thus far been given, and this unquestionably because of a lack of authentic data regarding the conquering of the wilderness. Considering how many years the pioneers struggled on the border of this country, the history of their efforts is meager and obscure. If the years at the close of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century were full of stirring adventure on the part of the colonists along the Atlantic coast, how crowded must they have been for the almost forgotten pioneers who daringly invaded the trackless wilds. None there was to chronicle the fight of these sturdy travelers toward the setting sun. The story of their stormy lives, of their heroism, and of their sacrifice for the benefit of future generations is too little known. It is to a better understanding of those days that the author has labored to draw from his ancestors' notes a new and striking portrayal of the frontier, one which shall paint the fever of freedom, that powerful impulse which lured so many to unmarked graves, one which shall show his work, his love, the effect of the causes which rendered his life so hard, and surely one which does not forget the wronged Indian. The frontier in 1777 produced white men so savage as to be men in name only. These outcasts and renegades lived among the savages, and during 30 years harassed the border, perpetrating all manner of fiendish cruelties upon the settlers. They were no less cruel to the red men whom they ruled, and at the height of their bloody careers made futile the Moravian missionaries' long labors, and destroyed the beautiful hamlet of the Christian Indians called Gnaddenhutten, or Village of Peace. And while the border produced such outlaws, so did it produce hunters, eke Boone, the Zanes, the McCullochs, and Wetzel, that strange silent man whose deeds are still whispered in the country where he once roamed in his insatiate pursuit of savages and renegades, and who was purely a product of the times. Civilization could not have brought forth a man like Wetzel. Great revolutions, great crises, great moments come, and produce the men to deal with them. The border needed Wetzel. The settlers would have needed many more years in which to make permanent homes, had it not been for him. He was never a pioneer, but always a hunter after Indians. When not on the track of the savage foe, he was in the settlement, with his keen eye and ear ever alert for signs of the enemy. To the superstitious Indians he was a shadow, a spirit of the border, which breathed menace from the dark forests. To the settlers he was the right arm of defense, a fitting leader for those few implacable and unerring frontiersmen who made the settlement of the West a possibility. And if this story of one of his relentless pursuits shows the man as he truly was, loved by pioneers, respected and feared by redmen, and hated by renegades, if it softens a little the ruthless name history accords him, the writer will have been well repaid. Z. G. End of Introduction to the Spirit of the Border by Zane Grey. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. Of the Spirit of the Border by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 1. Nell, I'm growing powerful fond of you. So you must be, Master Joe, if often telling makes it true. The girl spoke simply, and with an absence of that roguishness which was characteristic of her. Playful words, arch smiles, and a touch of coquetry had seemed natural to Nell, but now her grave tone and her almost wistful glance disconcerted Joe. During all the long journey over the mountains she had been gay and bright, while now, when they were about to part, perhaps never to meet again, she showed him the deeper and more earnest side of her character. It checked his boldness as nothing else had done. Suddenly there came to him the real meaning of a woman's love when she bestows it without reservation. Silenced by the thought that he had not understood her at all, and the knowledge that he had been half in sport, he gazed out over the wild country before them. The scene impressed its quietness upon the young couple, and brought more forcibly to their minds the fact that they were at the gateway of the unknown West, that somewhere beyond this rude frontier settlement, out there in those unbroken forests stretching dark and silent before them, was to be their future home. From the high bank where they stood the land sloped and narrowed gradually until it ended in a sharp point which marked the last bit of land between the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. Here these swift streams merged and formed the broad Ohio. The new-born river, even here at its beginning, proud and swelling as if already certain of its far-away grandeur, swept majestically round a wide curve, and apparently lost itself in the forest foliage. On the narrow point of land commanding a view of the rivers stood a long, low structure, enclosed by a stockade fence, on the four corners of which were little box-shaped houses that bulged out as if trying to see what was going on beneath. The massive timbers used in the construction of this fort, the square, compact form, and the small, dark holes cut into the walls gave the structure a threatening, impregnable aspect. Below Nell and Joe, on the bank, were many log cabins. The yellow clay which filled the chinks between the logs gave these a peculiar striped appearance. There was life and bustle in the vicinity of these dwellings, in sharp contrast with the still grandeur of the neighboring forests. There were canvas-covered wagons around which curly-headed youngsters were playing. Several horses were grazing on the short grass, and 6 red and white oxen munched at the hay that had been thrown to them. The smoke of many fires curled upward, and near the blaze hovered ruddy-faced women who stirred the contents of steaming kettles. One man swung an axe with a vigorous sweep, and the clean, sharp strokes rang on the air. Another hammered stakes into the ground on which to hang a kettle. Before a large cabin a fur trader was exhibiting his wares to 3 Indians. A second redskin was carrying a pack of pelts from a canoe drawn up on the river bank. A small group of persons stood near. Some were indifferent, and others gazed curiously at the savages. Two children peeped from behind their mother's skirts, as if half curious, half frightened. From this scene, the significance of which had just dawned on him, Joe turned his eyes again to his companion. It was a sweet face he saw, one that was sedate, but had a promise of innumerable smiles. The blue eyes could not long hide flashes of merriment. The girl turned, and the two young people looked at each other. Her eyes softened with a woman's gentleness as they rested upon him, for, broad of shoulder and lithe and strong as a deerstalker, he was good to look at. "Listen," she said, "we have known each other only 3 weeks. Since you joined our wagon train and have been so kind to me and so helpful to make that long, rough ride endurable, you have won my regard. I cannot say more, even if I would. You told me you ran away from your Virginian home to seek adventure on the frontier, and that you knew no one in all this wild country. You even said you could not, or would not, work at farming. Perhaps my sister and I are as unfitted as you for this life, but we must cling to our uncle because he is the only relative we have. He has come out here to join the Moravians and to preach the gospel to these Indians. We shall share his life and help him all we can. You have been telling me you cared for me, and now that we are about to part, I don't know what to say to you, unless it is, give up this intention of yours to seek adventure and come with us. It seems to me you need not hunt for excitement here. It will come unsought." "I wish I were Jim," he said suddenly. "Who is Jim?" "My brother." "Tell me of him." "There's nothing much to tell. He and I are all that are left of our people, as are you and Kate of yours. Jim's a preacher, and the best fellow. Oh, I cared a lot for Jim." "Then why did you leave him?" "I was tired of Williamsburg. I quarreled with the fellow and hurt him. Besides, I wanted to see the West. I'd like to hunt deer and bear and fight Indians. Oh, I'm not much good." "Was Jim the only one you cared for?" asked Nell, smiling. She was surprised to find him grave. "Yes, except my horse and dog, and I had to leave them behind," answered Joe, bowing his head a little. "You'd like to be Jim because he's a preacher and could help Uncle convert the Indians?" "Well, yes, partly that, but mostly because somehow something you've said or done has made me care for you in a different way, and I'd like to be worthy of you." "I don't think I can believe it when you say you are no good," she replied. "Nell!" he cried, and suddenly grasped her hand. She wrenched herself free and leaped away from him. Her face was bright now, and the promise of smiles was made good. "Behave yourself, sir." She tossed her head with a familiar backward motion to throw the chestnut hair from her face, and looked at him with eyes veiled slightly under their lashes. "You will go with Kate and me?" Before he could answer, a cry from some one on the plain below attracted their attention. They turned and saw another wagon train pulling into the settlement. The children were shouting and running alongside the weary oxen. Men and women went forward expectantly. "That must be the train Uncle expected. Let us go down," said Nell. Joe did not answer, but followed her down the path. When they gained a clump of willows near the cabins, he bent forward and took her hand. She saw the reckless gleam in his eyes. "Don't! They'll see," she whispered. "If that's the only reason you have, I reckon I don't care," said Joe. "What do you mean? I didn't tell Oh, let me go," implored Nell. She tried to release the hand Joe had grasped in his broad palm, but in vain. The more she struggled, the firmer was his hold. A frown wrinkled her brow, and her eyes sparkled with spirit. She saw the fur trader's wife looking out of the window, and remembered laughing and telling the good woman she did not like this young man. It was perhaps because she feared those sharp eyes that she resented his audacity. She opened her mouth to rebuke him, but no words came. Joe had bent his head and softly closed her lips with his own. For the single instant during which Nell stood transfixed, as if with surprise, and looking up at Joe, she was dumb. Usually the girl was ready with sharp or saucy words, and impulsive in her movements. But now the bewilderment of being kissed, particularly within view of the trader's wife, confused her. Then she heard voices, and as Joe turned away with a smile on his face, the unusual warmth in her heart was followed by an angry throbbing. Joe's tall figure stood out distinctly as he leisurely strolled toward the incoming wagon train without looking backward. Flashing after him a glance that boded wordy trouble in the future, she ran into the cabin. As she entered the door, it seemed certain the grizzled frontiersman sitting on the bench outside had grinned knowingly at her, and winked as if to say he would keep her secret. Mrs. Wentz, the fur trader's wife, was seated by the open window which faced the fort. She was a large woman, strong of feature, and with that calm placidity of expression common to people who have lived long in sparsely populated districts. Nell glanced furtively at her, and thought she detected the shadow of a smile in the gray eyes. "I saw you and your sweetheart making love behind the willow," Mrs. Wentz said in a matter-of-fact voice. "I don't see why you need to hide to do it. We folks out here like to see the young people sparking. Your young man is a fine appearing chap. I felt certain you was sweethearts, for all you allowed you'd known him only a few days. Lize Davis said she saw he was sweet on you. I like his face. Jake, my man, says as how he'll make a good husband for you, and he'll take to the frontier like a duck does to water. I'm sorry you'll not tarry here a while. We don't see many lasses, especially any as pretty as you, and you'll find it more quiet and lonesome the farther west you get. Jake knows all about Fort Henry, and Jeff Lynn, the hunter outside, he knows Eb and Jack Zane and Wetzel and all those Fort Henry men. You'll be getting married out there, won't you?" "You are quite wrong," said Nell, who all the while Mrs. Wentz was speaking grew rosier and rosier. "We're not anything—" Then Nell hesitated, and finally ceased speaking. She saw that denials or explanations were futile. The simple woman had seen the kiss and formed her own conclusions. During the few days Nell had spent at Fort Pitt, she had come to understand that the dwellers on the frontier took everything as a matter of course. She had seen them manifest a certain pleasure, but neither surprise, concern, nor any of the quick impulses so common among other people. And this was another lesson Nell took to heart. She realized that she was entering upon a life absolutely different from her former one, and the thought caused her to shrink from the ordeal. Yet all the suggestions regarding her future home, the stories told about Indians, renegades, and of the wild border life, fascinated her. These people who had settled in this wild region were simple, honest, and brave. They accepted what came as facts not to be questioned, and believed what looked true. Evidently the fur trader's wife and her female neighbors had settled in their minds the relation in which the girl stood to Joe. This latter reflection heightened Nell's resentment toward her lover. She stood with her face turned away from Mrs. Wentz. The little frown deepened, and she nervously tapped her foot on the floor. "Where is my sister?" she presently asked. "She went to see the wagon train come in. Everybody's out there." Nell deliberated a moment, and then went into the open air. She saw a number of canvas-covered wagons drawn up in front of the cabins. The vehicles were dusty and the wheels encrusted with yellow mud. The grizzled frontiersman who had smiled at Nell stood leaning on his gun, talking to three men whose travel-stained and worn homespun clothes suggested a long and toilsome journey. There was the bustle of excitement incident to the arrival of strangers, to the quick exchange of greetings, the unloading of wagons, and unharnessing of horses and oxen. Nell looked here and there for her sister. Finally she saw her standing near her uncle while he conversed with one of the teamsters. The girl did not approach them, but glanced quickly around in search of someone else. At length she saw Joe unloading goods from one of the wagons. His back was turned toward her, but she at once recognized the challenge conveyed by the broad shoulders. She saw no other person, gave heed to nothing save what was to her righteous indignation. Hearing her footsteps, the young man turned, glancing at her admiringly, said, "Good evening, miss." Nell had not expected such a matter-of-fact greeting from Joe. There was not the slightest trace of repentance in his calm face, and he placidly continued his labor. "Aren't you sorry you treated me so?" burst out Nell. His coolness was exasperating. Instead of the contrition and apology she had expected, and which was her due, he evidently intended to tease her, as he had done so often. The young man dropped a blanket and stared. "I don't understand," he said gravely. "I never saw you before." This was too much for quick-tempered Nell. She had had some vague idea of forgiving him, after he had sued sufficiently for pardon, but now, forgetting her good intentions in the belief that he was making sport of her when he should have pleaded for forgiveness, she swiftly raised her hand and slapped him smartly. The red blood flamed to the young man's face. As he staggered backward with his hand to his cheek, she heard a smothered exclamation behind her, and then the quick, joyous barking of a dog. When Nell turned, she was amazed to see Joe standing beside the wagon, while a big white dog was leaping upon him. Suddenly she felt faint. Bewildered, she looked from Joe to the man she had just struck, but could not say which was the man who professed to love her. "Jim, so you followed me!" cried Joe, starting forward and flinging his arms around the other. "Yes, Joe, and right glad I am to find you," answered the young man, while a peculiar expression of pleasure came over his face. "It's good to see you again, and here's my old dog Mose. But how on earth did you know? Where did you strike my trail? What are you going to do out here on the frontier? Tell me all. What happened after I left?" Then Joe saw Nell standing near by, pale and distressed, and he felt something was amiss. He glanced quickly from her to his brother. She seemed to be dazed, and Jim looked grave. "What the deuce? Nell, this is my brother Jim, the one I told you about. Jim, this is my friend, Miss Wells." "I am happy to meet Miss Wells," said Jim with a smile, "even though she did slap my face for nothing." "Slapped you? What for?" Then the truth dawned on Joe, and he laughed until the tears came into his eyes. "She took you for me! Ha, ha! Oh, this is great!" Nell's face was now rosy red, and moisture glistened in her eyes, but she tried bravely to stand her ground. Humiliation had taken the place of anger. I'm sorry, Mr. Downs. I did take you for him. He has insulted me." Then she turned and ran into the cabin. End of Chapter 1 of The Spirit of the Border by Zane Grey. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. Chapter 2 of The Spirit of the Border by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 2. Joe and Jim were singularly alike. They were nearly the same size, very tall, but so heavily built as to appear of medium height, while their gray eyes, and indeed every feature of their clean-cut faces, corresponded so exactly as to proclaim them brothers. "Already up to your old tricks?" asked Jim, with his hand on Joe's shoulder, as they both watched Nell's flight. "I'm really fond of her, Jim, and I didn't mean to hurt her feelings. But tell me about yourself. What made you come west?" "To teach the Indians, and I was, no doubt, strongly influenced by your being here." "You're going to do as you ever have, make some sacrifice. You're always devoting yourself, if not to me, to some other. Now it's your life you're giving up. To try to convert the redskins and influence me for good is in both cases impossible. How often have I said there wasn't any good in me? My desire is to kill Indians, not preach to them, Jim. I'm glad to see you, but I wish you hadn't come. This wild frontier is no place for a preacher." "I think it is," said Jim, quietly. "Well, what of Rose, the girl you were to marry?" Joe glanced quickly at his brother. Jim's face paled slightly as he turned away. "I'll speak once more of her, and then never again," he answered. "You knew Rose better than I did. Once you tried to tell me she was too fond of admiration, and I rebuked you. But now I see that your wider experience of women had taught you things I could not then understand. She was untrue. When you left Williamsburg, apparently because you had gambled with Jewett and afterward fought him, I was not misled. You made the game of cards a pretense. You sought it simply as an opportunity to wreak your vengeance on him for his villainy toward me. Well, it's all over now. Though you cruelly beat and left him disfigured for life, he will live, and you are saved from murder, thank God. When I learned of your departure, I yearned to follow. Then I met a preacher who spoke of having intended to go west with a Mr. Wells of the Moravian Mission. I immediately said I would go in his place, and here I am. I'm fortunate in that I have found both him and you. I'm sorry I didn't kill Jewett. I certainly meant to. Anyway, there's some comfort in knowing I left my mark on him. He was a sneaking, cold-blooded fellow, with his white hair and pale face, and always fawning round the girls. I hated him, and gave it to him good." Joe spoke musingly and complacently, as though it was a trivial thing to compass the killing of a man. "Well, Jim, you're here now, and there's no help for it. We'll go along with this Moravian preacher and his nieces. If you haven't any great regrets for the past, why, all may be well yet. I can see that the border is the place for me. But now, Jim, for once in your life, take a word of advice from me. We're out on the frontier, where every man looks after himself. Your being a minister won't protect you here, where every man wears a knife and a tomahawk, and where most of them are desperadoes. Cut out that soft voice and most of your gentle ways, and be a little more like your brother. Be as kind as you like, and preach all you want to. But when some of these buckskin-legged frontiersmen try to walk all over you, as they will, take your own part in a way you have never taken it before. I had my lesson the first few days out with the wagon train. It was a case of 4 fights, but I'm all right now." "Joe, I won't run, if that's what you mean," answered Jim, with a laugh. "Yes, I understand that a new life begins here, and I'm content. If I can find my work in it and remain with you, I shall be happy." "Ah, old Mose, I'm glad to see you," Joe cried to the big dog, who came nosing round him. "You've brought this old fellow. Did you bring the horses?" "Look behind the wagon." With the dog bounding before him, Jim did as he was directed, and there found 2 horses tethered side by side. Little wonder that his eyes gleamed with delight. One was jet black, the other iron gray, and in every line the clean-limbed animals showed the thoroughbred. The black threw up his slim head and whinnied, with affection clearly shining in his soft dark eyes as he recognized his master. "Lance, old fellow, how did I ever leave you?" murmured Joe, as he threw his arm over the arched neck. Mose stood by, looking up, and wagging his tail in token of happiness at the reunion of the 3 old friends. There were tears in Joe's eyes when, with a last affectionate caress, he turned away from his pet. "Come, Jim, I'll take you to Mr. Wells." They started across the little square, while Mose went back under the wagon, but at a word from Joe he bounded after them, trotting contentedly at their heels. Halfway to the cabins a big, raw-boned teamster, singing in a drunken voice, came staggering toward them. Evidently he had just left the group of people who had gathered near the Indians. "I didn't expect to see drunkenness out here," said Jim in a low tone. "There's lots of it. I saw that fellow yesterday when he couldn't walk. Wentz told me he was a bad customer." The teamster, his red face bathed in perspiration, and his sleeves rolled up, showing brown, knotty arms, lurched toward them. As they met, he aimed a kick at the dog, but Mose leaped nimbly aside, avoiding the heavy boot. He did not growl nor show his teeth, but the great white head sank forward a little, and the lithe body crouched for a spring. "Don't touch that dog. He'll tear your leg off," Joe cried sharply. "Say, pard, come and have a drink," replied the teamster with a friendly leer. "I don't drink," answered Joe curtly, and moved on. The teamster growled something, of which only the word "parson" was intelligible to the brothers. Joe stopped and looked back. His gray eyes seemed to contract. They did not flash, but shaded and lost their warmth. Jim saw the change, and, knowing what it signified, took Joe's arm as he gently urged him away. The teamster's shrill voice could be heard until they entered the fur trader's cabin. An old man with long white hair flowing from beneath his wide-brimmed hat sat near the door, holding one of Mrs. Wentz's children on his knee. His face was deep-lined and serious, but kindness shone from his mild blue eyes. "Mr. Wells, this is my brother James. He is a preacher, and has come in place of the man you expected from Williamsburg." The old minister arose and extended his hand, gazing earnestly at the newcomer meanwhile. Evidently he approved of what he saw in his quick scrutiny of the other's face, for his lips were wreathed with a smile of welcome. "Mr. Downs, I am glad to meet you, and to know you will go with me. I thank God I shall take into the wilderness one who is young enough to carry on the work when my days are done." "I will make it my duty to help you in whatsoever way lies in my power," answered Jim earnestly. "We have a great work before us. I have heard many scoffers who claim that it is worse than folly to try to teach these fierce savages Christianity, but I know it can be done, and my heart is in my work. I have no fear, yet I would not conceal from you, young man, that the danger of going among these hostile Indians must be great." "I will not hesitate because of that. My sympathy is with the red man. I have had an opportunity of studying Indian nature, and believe the race inherently noble. He has been driven to make war, and I want to help him into other paths." Joe left the two ministers talking earnestly and turned toward Mrs. Wentz. The fur trader's wife was glowing with pleasure. She held in her hand several rude trinkets, and was explaining to her listener, a young woman, that the toys were for the children, having been brought all the way from Williamsburg. "Kate, where's Nell?" Joe asked of the girl. "She went on an errand for Mrs. Wentz." Kate Wells was the opposite of her sister. Her motions were slow, easy, and consistent with her large, full form. Her brown eyes and hair contrasted sharply with Nell's. The greatest difference in the sisters lay in that Nell's face was sparkling and full of the fire of her eager young life, while Kate's was calm, like the unruffled surface of a deep lake. "That's Jim, my brother. We're going with you," said Joe. "Are you? I'm glad," answered the girl, looking at the handsome, earnest face of the young minister. "Your brother's like you for all the world," whispered Mrs. Wentz. "He does look like you," said Kate, with her slow smile. "Which means you think or hope that that is all," retorted Joe laughingly. "Well, Kate, there the resemblance ends. Thank God for Jim." He spoke in a sad, bitter tone, which caused both women to look at him wonderingly. Joe had to them ever been full of surprises. Never until then had they seen evidences of sadness in his face. A moment's silence ensued. Mrs. Wentz gazed lovingly at the children, who were playing with the trinkets, while Kate mused over the young man's remark, and began studying his half-averted face. She felt warmly drawn to him by the strange expression in the glance he had given his brother. The tenderness in his eyes did not harmonize with much of this wild and reckless boy's behavior. To Kate he had always seemed so bold, so cold, so different from other men, and yet here was proof that Master Joe loved his brother. The murmured conversation of the two ministers was interrupted by a low cry from outside the cabin. A loud, coarse laugh followed, and then a husky voice. "Hold on, my purty lass!" Joe took 2 long strides and was on the doorstep. He saw Nell struggling violently in the grasp of the half-drunken teamster. "I'll just have to kiss this lassie for luck," he said, in a tone of good humor. At the same instant Joe saw 3 loungers laughing, and a fourth, a grizzled frontiersman, starting forward with a yell. "Let me go!" cried Nell. Just when the teamster had pulled her close to him, and was bending his red, moist face to hers, 2 brown, sinewy hands grasped his neck with an angry clutch. Deprived thus of breath, his mouth opened, his tongue protruded. His eyes seemed starting from their sockets, and his arms beat the air. Then he was lifted and flung with a crash against the cabin wall. Falling, he lay in a heap on the grass, while the blood flowed from a cut on his temple. "What's this?" cried a man authoritatively. He had come up swiftly, and arrived at the scene where stood the grizzled frontiersman. "It was pretty handy, Wentz. I couldn't have did better myself, and I was comin' for that purpose," said the frontiersman. "Leffler was tryin' to kiss the lass. He's been drunk for 2 days. That little girl's sweetheart can handle himself some, now you take my word on it." "I'll agree Leff's bad when he's drinking," answered the fur trader, and to Joe he added, "He's liable to look you up when he comes around." "Tell him if I'm here when he gets sober I'll kill him," Joe cried in a sharp voice. His gaze rested once more on the fallen teamster, and again an odd contraction of his eyes was noticeable. The glance was cutting, as if with the flash of cold gray steel. "Nell, I'm sorry I wasn't round sooner," he said, apologetically, as if it was owing to his neglect the affair had happened. As they entered the cabin, Nell stole a glance at him. This was the 3rd time he had injured a man because of her. She had on several occasions seen that cold, steely glare in his eyes, and it had always frightened her. It was gone, however, before they were inside the building. He said something which she did not hear distinctly, and his calm voice allayed her excitement. She had been angry with him, but now she realized that her resentment had disappeared. He had spoken so kindly after the outburst. Had he not shown that he considered himself her protector and lover? A strange emotion, sweet and subtle as the taste of wine, thrilled her, while a sense of fear because of his strength was mingled with her pride in it. Any other girl would have been only too glad to have such a champion. She would, too, hereafter, for he was a man of whom to be proud. "Look here, Nell, you haven't spoken to me," Joe cried suddenly, seeming to understand that she had not even heard what he said, so engrossed had she been with her reflections. "Are you mad with me yet?" he continued. "Why, Nell, I love you." Evidently Joe thought such fact a sufficient reason for any act on his part. His tender tone conquered Nell, and she turned to him with flushed cheeks and glad eyes. "I wasn't angry at all," she whispered, and then, eluding the arm he extended, she ran into the other room. End of Chapter 2 of The Spirit of the Border by Zane Grey. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. Of The Spirit of the Border by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 3. Joe lounged in the doorway of the cabin, thoughtfully contemplating 2 quiet figures that were lying in the shade of a maple tree. One he recognized as the Indian with whom Jim had spent an earnest hour that morning. The red son of the woods was wrapped in slumber. He had placed under his head a many-hued homespun shirt, which the young preacher had given him. But while asleep, his head had rolled off this improvised pillow, and the bright garment lay free, attracting the eye. Certainly it had led to the train of thought which had found lodgment in Joe's fertile brain. The other sleeper was a short, stout man whom Joe had seen several times before. This last fellow did not appear to be well balanced in his mind, and was the butt of the settlers' jokes, while the children called him Loorey. He, like the Indian, was sleeping off the effects of the previous night's dissipation. During a few moments Joe regarded the recumbent figures with an expression on his face which told that he thought in them were great possibilities for sport. With one quick glance around, he disappeared within the cabin, and when he showed himself at the door, surveying the village square with mirthful eyes, he held in his hand a small basket of Indian design. It was made of twisted grass, and simply contained several bits of soft, chalky stone, such as the Indians used for painting, which collection Joe had discovered among the fur trader's wares. He glanced around once more, and saw that all those in sight were busy with their work. He gave the short man a push and chuckled when there was no response other than a lazy grunt. Joe took the Indian's gaudy shirt, and lifting Loorey, slipped it around him, shoved the latter's arms through the sleeves, and buttoned it in front. He streaked the round face with red and white paint, and then, dexterously extracting the eagle plume from the Indian's headdress, stuck it in Loorey's thick shock of hair. It was all done in a moment, after which Joe replaced the basket and went down to the river. Several times that morning he had visited the rude wharf where Jeff Lynn, the grizzled old frontiersman, busied himself with preparations for the raft journey down the Ohio. Lynn had been employed to guide the missionary's party to Fort Henry, and as the brothers had acquainted him with their intention of accompanying the travelers, he had constructed a raft for them and their horses. Joe laughed when he saw the dozen 2-foot logs fastened together, upon which a rude shack had been erected for shelter. This slight protection from sun and storm was all the brothers would have on their long journey. Joe noted, however, that the larger raft had been prepared with some thought for the comfort of the girls. The floor of the little hut was raised so that the waves which broke over the logs could not reach it. Taking a peep into the structure, Joe was pleased to see that Nell and Kate would be comfortable, even during a storm. A buffalo robe and 2 red blankets gave to the interior a cozy, warm look. He observed that some of the girls' luggage was already on board. "When'll we be off?" he inquired. "Sunup," answered Lynn briefly. "I'm glad of that. I like to be on the go in the early morning," said Joe cheerfully. "Most folks from over east ways ain't in a hurry to tackle the river," replied Lynn, eyeing Joe sharply. "It's a beautiful river, and I'd like to sail on it from here to where it ends, and then come back to go again," Joe replied warmly. "In a hurry to be a-goin'? I'll allow you'll see some slim red devils with feathers in their hair slipping among the trees along the bank, and maybe you'll hear the ping which is made when whistlin' lead hits. Perhaps you want to be back here by tomorrow sundown." "Not I," said Joe, with his short, cool laugh. The old frontiersman slowly finished his task of coiling up a rope of wet cowhide, and then, producing a dirty pipe, he took a live ember from the fire and placed it on the bowl. He sucked slowly at the pipe stem, and soon puffed out a great cloud of smoke. Sitting on a log, he deliberately surveyed the robust shoulders and long, heavy limbs of the young man, with a keen appreciation of their symmetry and strength. Agility, endurance, and courage were more to a borderman than all else. A newcomer on the frontier was always sized up with reference to these points, and respected in proportion to the measure in which he possessed them. Old Jeff Lynn, riverman, hunter, frontiersman, puffed slowly at his pipe while he mused thus to himself. "Mebbe I'm wrong in takin' a likin' to this youngster so sudden. Maybe it's because I'm fond of his sunny-haired lass, and again, maybe it's because I'm gettin' old and likes young folks better'n I once did. Anyway, I'm kinder thinkin' if this young feller gets worked out, say for about 20 pounds less, he'll lick a whole raft load of wildcats." Joe walked to and fro on the logs, ascertained how the raft was put together, and took a pull on the long, clumsy steering oar. At length he seated himself beside Lynn. He was eager to ask questions, to know about the rafts, the river, the forest, the Indians, everything in connection with this wild life, but already he had learned that questioning these frontiersmen is a sure means of closing their lips. "Ever handled a long rifle?" asked Lynn after a silence. "Yes," answered Joe simply. "Ever shoot anything?" the frontiersman questioned, when he had taken 4 or 5 puffs at his pipe. "Squirrels." "Good practice shooting squirrels," observed Jeff, after another silence, long enough to allow Joe to talk if he was so inclined. "Can you hit one, say 100 yards?" "Yes, but not every time in the head," returned Joe. There was an apologetic tone in his answer. Another interval followed in which neither spoke. Jeff was slowly pursuing his line of thought. After Joe's last remark he returned his pipe to his pocket and brought out a tobacco pouch. He tore off a large portion of the weed and thrust it into his mouth. Then he held out the little buckskin sack to Joe. "Have a chaw," he said. To offer tobacco to anyone was absolutely a borderman's guarantee of friendliness toward that person. Jeff expectorated half a dozen times, each time coming a little nearer the stone he was aiming at, some 5 yards distant. Possibly this was the borderman's way of oiling up his conversational machinery. At all events, he commenced to talk. "Your brother's going to preach out there, ain't he? Preachin' is all right, I'll allow, but I'm kinder doubtful about preachin' to redskins. Howsomever, I've knowed Injuns who are good fellows, and there's no tellin'. What are ye going in for, farmin'?" "No, I wouldn't make a good farmer." "Just come out kinder wild like, eh?" rejoined Jeff knowingly. "I wanted to come west because I was tired of tame life. I loved the forest. I want to fish and hunt, and I think I'd like to see Indians." "I kinder thought so," said the old frontiersman, nodding his head as though he perfectly understood Joe's case. "Well, lad, where you're goin' seein' Injuns ain't a matter of choice. You has to see 'em, and fight 'em, too. We've had bad times for years out here on the border, and I'm thinkin' wuss is comin'. Did you ever hear the name Girty?" "Yes, he's a renegade." "He's a traitor, and Jim and George Girty, his brothers, are pison rattlesnake Injuns. Simon Girty's bad enough, but Jim's the wust. He's now wusser'n a full-blooded Delaware. He's all the time on the lookout to capture white women to take to his Injun teepee. Simon Girty and his pals, McKee and Elliott, deserted from that thar fort right afore your eyes. They're now livin' among the redskins down Fort Henry way, raisin' as much hell for the settlers as they can." "Is Fort Henry near the Indian towns?" asked Joe. "There's Delawares, Shawnees, and Hurons all along the Ohio below Fort Henry." "Where is the Moravian mission located?" "Well, lad, the Village of Peace, as the Indians call it, is right in the midst of that Injun country. I expect it's a matter of 100 miles below and cross country a little from Fort Henry." "The fort must be an important point, is it not?" "Well, I guess so. It's the last place on the river," answered Lynn, with a grim smile. "There's only a stockade there and a handful of men. The Injuns have stormed down on it time and again, but they have never burned it. Only such men as Colonel Zane, his brother Jack, and Wetzel could have kept that fort standing all these bloody years. Eb Zane's got but a few men, yet he can handle 'em some, and with such scouts as Jack Zane and Wetzel, he allus knows what's going on among the Injuns." "I've heard of Colonel Zane. He was an officer under Lord Dunmore. The hunters here speak often of Jack Zane and Wetzel. What are they?" "Jack Zane is a hunter and guide. I knowed him well a few years back. He's a quiet, mild chap, but a streak of chain lightning when he's riled. Wetzel is an Injun killer. Some people say as how he's crazy over scalp hunting, but I reckon that's not so. I've seen him a few times. He don't hang around the settlement except when the Injuns are up, and nobody sees him much. At home he sets round silent like, and then maybe next morning he'll be gone and won't show up for days or weeks. But all the frontier knows of his deeds. For instance, I've heard of settlers getting up in the morning and finding a couple of dead and scalped Injuns right in front of their cabins. No one knowed who killed 'em, but everybody says Wetzel. He's allus warnin' the settlers when they need to flee to the fort, and sure he's right every time, because when these men go back to their cabins they find nothin' but ashes. There couldn't be any farmin' done out there but for Wetzel." "What does he look like?" questioned Joe, much interested. "Wetzel stands straight as the oak over thar. He'd have to go sideways to get his shoulders in that door, but he's as light of foot and fast as a deer. And his eyes, why, lad, you can hardly look into 'em. If you ever see Wetzel, you'll know him to once." "I want to see him," Joe spoke quickly, his eyes lighting with an eager flash. "He must be a great fighter." "Is he? Lew Wetzel is the heftiest of 'em all, and we have some as can fight out here. I was down the river a few years ago, and joined a party to go out and hunt up some redskins as had been reported. Wetzel was with us. We soon struck Injun sign, and then come on to a lot of the pesky varmints. We was all for going home, because we had a small force. When we started to go, we finds Wetzel sitting calm like on a log. We said, 'Ain't you going home?' And he replied, 'I come out here to find redskins, and now as we've found 'em, I'm not going to run away.' And we left him sitting there. Oh, Wetzel is a fighter." "I hope I shall see him," said Joe once more, the warm light which made him look so boyish still glowing in his face. "Mebbe you'll get to, and sure you'll see redskins, and not tame ones nuther." At this moment the sound of excited voices near the cabins broke in on the conversation. Joe saw several persons run toward the large cabin and disappear behind it. He smiled as he thought perhaps the commotion had been caused by the awakening of the Indian brave. Rising to his feet, Joe went toward the cabin, and soon saw the cause of the excitement. A small crowd of men and women, all laughing and talking, surrounded the Indian brave and the little stout fellow. Joe heard someone groan, and then a deep, guttural voice. "Paleface, big steal! Injun mad, heap mad! Kill paleface!" After elbowing his way into the group, Joe saw the Indian holding Loorey with one hand, while he poked him on the ribs with the other. The captive's face was the picture of dismay. Even the streaks of paint did not hide his look of fear and bewilderment. The poor half-witted fellow was so badly frightened that he could only groan. "Silvertip, scalp paleface!" growled the savage, giving Loorey another blow on the side. This time he bent over in pain. The bystanders were divided in feeling. The men laughed, while the women murmured sympathetically. "This is not a bit funny," muttered Joe, as he pushed his way nearly to the middle of the crowd. Then he stretched out a long arm that, bare and brawny, looked as though it might have been a blacksmith's, and grasped the Indian's sinewy wrist with a force that made him loosen his hold on Loorey instantly. "I stole the shirt. Fun, joke," said Joe. "Scalp me if you want to scalp anyone." The Indian looked quickly at the powerful form before him. With a twist he slipped his arm from Joe's grasp. "Big paleface heap fun. All squaw play," he said scornfully. There was a menace in his somber eyes as he turned abruptly and left the group. "I'm afraid you've made an enemy," said Jake Wentz to Joe. "An Indian never forgets an insult, and that's how he regarded your joke. Silvertip has been friendly here because he sells us his pelts. He's a Shawnee chief. There he goes through the willows." By this time Jim and Mr. Wells, Mrs. Wentz, and the girls had joined the group. They all watched Silvertip get into his canoe and paddle away. "A bad sign," said Wentz, and then turning to Jeff Lynn, who joined the party at that moment, he briefly explained the circumstances. "Never did like Silver. He's a crafty redskin, and not to be trusted," replied Jeff. "He has turned around and is looking back," Nell said quickly. "So he has," observed the fur trader. The Indian was now several hundred yards down the swift river, and for an instant had ceased paddling. The sun shone brightly on his eagle plumes. He remained motionless for a moment, and even at such a distance the dark, changeless face could be discerned. He lifted his hand and shook it menacingly. "If you don't hear from that redskin again, Jeff Lynn don't know nothin'," calmly said the old frontiersman. End of Chapter 3 of The Spirit of the Border by Zane Grey. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. Chapter 4 of The Spirit of the Border by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 4. As the rafts drifted with the current, the voyagers saw the settlers on the landing place diminish until they had faded from indistinct figures to mere black specks against the green background. Then came the last wave of a white scarf, faintly in the distance, and at length the dark outline of the fort was all that remained to their regretful gaze. Quickly that too disappeared behind the green hill, which, with its bold front, forces the river to take a wide turn. The Ohio, widening in its course between high wooded bluffs, rolled on and on into the wilderness. Beautiful as was the ever-changing scenery, rugged gray-faced cliffs on one side contrasting with green-clad hills on the other, there hovered over land and water something more striking than beauty. Above all hung a still atmosphere of calmness, of loneliness. And this penetrating solitude marred somewhat the pleasure which might have been found in the picturesque scenery, and caused the voyagers, to whom this country was new, to take less interest in the gaily feathered birds and stealthy animals that were to be seen on the way. By the forms of wild life along the banks of the river, this strange intruder on their peace was regarded with attention. The birds and beasts evinced little fear of the floating rafts. The sandhill crane, stalking along the shore, lifted his long neck as the unfamiliar thing came floating by, and then stood still and silent as a statue until the rafts disappeared from view. Blue herons, feeding along the bars, saw the unusual spectacle, and, uttering surprised booms, they spread wide wings and lumbered away along the shore. The crows circled above the voyagers, cawing in not unfriendly excitement. Smaller birds alighted on the raised poles, and several, a robin, a catbird, and a little brown wren, ventured with hesitating boldness to peck at the crumbs the girls threw to them. Deer waded knee-deep in the shallow water, and, lifting their heads, instantly became motionless and absorbed. Occasionally a buffalo appeared on the level stretch of bank, and, tossing his huge head, seemed inclined to resent the coming of this stranger into his domain. All day the rafts drifted steadily and swiftly down the river, presenting to the little party ever varying pictures of densely wooded hills, of jutting, broken cliffs with scant evergreen growth, of long reaches of sandy bar that glistened golden in the sunlight, and over all the flight and call of wild fowl, the flitting of woodland songsters, and now and then the whistle and bellow of the horned watchers in the forest. The intense blue of the vault above began to pale, and low down in the west a few fleecy clouds, gorgeously golden for a fleeting instant, then crimson-crowned for another, shaded and darkened as the setting sun sank behind the hills. Presently the red rays disappeared, a pink glow suffused the heavens, and at last, as gray twilight stole down over the hilltops, the crescent moon peeped above the wooded fringe of the western bluffs. "Hard and fast she is," sang out Jeff Lynn, as he fastened the rope to a tree at the head of a small island. "Haul off now, and we'll have supper. There's a fine spring under yon curly birch, and I fetched along a leg of deer meat. Hungry, little 'un?" He had worked hard all day steering the rafts, yet Nell had seen him smiling at her many times during the journey, and he had found time before the early start to arrange for her a comfortable seat. There was now a solicitude in the frontiersman's voice that touched her. "I'm famished," she replied with her bright smile. "I'm afraid I could eat a whole deer." They all climbed the sandy slope and found themselves on the summit of an oval island, with a pretty glade in the middle surrounded by birches. Bill, the second raftsman, a stolid, silent man, at once swung his axe upon a log of driftwood. Mr. Wells and Jim walked to and fro under the birches, and Kate and Nell sat on the grass, watching with great interest the old helmsman as he came up from the river, his brown hands and face shining from the scrubbing he had given them. Soon he had a fire cheerfully blazing, and after laying out the few utensils, he addressed himself to Joe. I'll tell you right here, lad, good venison can be spoiled by bad cuttin' and cookin'. You're slicin' it too thick. See, thar. Now salt good, and keep out'n the flame. On the red coals is best." With a sharpened stick, Jeff held the thin slices over the fire for a few moments. Then he laid them aside on some clean white oak chips Bill's axe had provided. The simple meal of meat, bread, and afterward a drink of the cold spring water was keenly relished by the hungry voyagers. When it had been eaten, Jeff threw a log on the fire and remarked: "Seein' as how we won't be in redskin territory for a while yet, we can have a fire. I'll allow you'll all be chilly and damp from river mist afore long, so toast yourselves good." "How far have we come to-day?" inquired Mr. Wells, his mind always intent on reaching the scene of his cherished undertaking. "'Bout 30-odd mile, I reckon. Not much on a trip, that's sartin, but we'll pick up to-morrer. We've got some quicker water, and the rafts have to go separate." "How quiet!" exclaimed Kate, suddenly breaking the silence that followed the frontiersman's answer. "Beautiful!" impetuously said Nell, looking up at Joe. A quick flash from his gray eyes answered her. He did not speak. Indeed, he had said little to her since the start, but his glance showed her how glad he was that she felt the sweetness and content of this wild land. "I was never in a wilderness before," broke in the earnest voice of the young minister. "I feel an almost overpowering sense of loneliness. I want to get near to you all. I feel lost. Yet it is grand, sublime." "Here is the promised land, the fruitful life, nature as it was created by God," replied the old minister impressively. "Tell us a story," said Nell to the old frontiersman, as he once more joined the circle around the fire. "So, little 'un, ye want a story?" queried Jeff, taking up a live coal and placing it in the bowl of his pipe. He took off his coonskin cap and carefully laid it aside. His weather-beaten face beamed in answer to the girl's request. He drew a long and audible pull at his black pipe, and sent forth slowly a cloud of white smoke. Deliberately poking the fire with a stick, as if stirring into life dead embers of the past, he sucked again at his pipe, and emitted a great puff of smoke that completely enveloped the grizzled head. From out that white cloud came his drawling voice. "You've seen that big curly birch over thar. That 'un has been kind of sorrowful like. Well, it used to stand straight and proud. I've knowed that tree all the years I've navigated this river, and it seems natural like to me that it now droops dyin', fer it shades the grave of as young and sweet and purty a lass as yourself, Miss Nell. Rivermen call this island George's Island, 'cause Washington once camped here. But of late years the name's got changed, and the men say something like this: 'We'll try and make Milly's Birch afore sundown,' just as Bill and me have done today. Some years agone I was comin' up from Fort Henry, and I had on board my slow old scow a lass named Milly. We never learned her other name. She come to me at the fort and tells us how her folks had been killed by Injuns, and she wanted to get back to Pitt to meet her sweetheart. I was agin her comin' all along, and fust off I said no. But when I seen tears in her blue eyes, and she puts her little hand on mine, I just wilted, and says to Jim Blair, 'She goes.' Well, just as might have been expected, and fact is I looked fer it, we was tackled by redskins. Somehow Jim Girty got wind of us hevin' a lass aboard, and he ketched up with us just below here. It's a bad place called Shawnee Rock, and I'll show it to you tomorrer. The renegade with his red devils attacked us thar, and we had a time gettin' away. Milly was shot. She lived fer a while, a couple of days, and all the time was so patient and sweet and brave with that renegade's bullet in her, fer he shot her when he seen he couldn't capture her. that there wasn't a blame man of us who wouldn't have died to grant her prayer, which was that she could live to once more see her lover." There was a long silence, during which the old frontiersman sat gazing into the fire with sad eyes. "We couldn't do nothin', and we buried her there under that birch, where she smiled her last sad, sweet smile, and died. Ever since then the river has been eatin' away at this island. It's only half as big as it was once, and another flood will take away this sandbar, these few birches, and Millie's grave." The old frontiersman's story affected all his listeners. The elder minister bowed his head and prayed that no such fate might overtake his nieces. The young minister looked again, as he had many times that day, at Nell's winsome face. The girls cast grave glances at the drooping birch, and their bright tears glistened in the fire glow. Once more Joe's eyes glinted with that steely flash, and as he gazed out over the wide, darkening expanse of water, his face grew cold and rigid. "I'll allow I might have told a more cheerful story, and I'll do so next time. But I wanted you all, particular the lasses, to know somethin' of the kind of country you're goin' into. The frontier needs women, but just yet it deals hard with them, and Jim Girty, with more of his kind, ain't dead yet." "Why don't some one kill him?" was Joe's sharp question. "Easier said than done, lad. Jim Girty is a white trader, but he's a cunnin' and fierce redskin in his ways and life. He knows the woods as a crow does, and he keeps out of sight 'cept when he's least expected. Then again, he's got Simon Girty, his brother, and almost the whole redskin tribe behind him. Injuns stick close to a white man that has turned against his own people, and Jim Girty hain't ever been ketched. Howsomever, I heard last trip that he'd been tryin' some of his tricks round Fort Henry, and that Wetzel is on his trail. Well, if it's so that Lew Wetzel is arter him, I wouldn't give a pinch of powder for the white redskin's chances of a long life." No one spoke, and Jeff, after knocking the ashes from his pipe, went down to the raft, returning shortly afterward with his blanket. This he laid down and rolled himself in it. Presently from under his coonskin cap came the words, "Well, I've turned in, and I advise you all to do the same." All save Joe and Nell acted on Jeff's suggestion. For a long time the young couple sat close together on the bank, gazing at the moonlight on the river. The night was perfect. A cool wind fanned the dying embers of the fire and softly stirred the leaves. Earlier in the evening a single frog had voiced his protest against the loneliness, but now his dismal croak was no longer heard. A snipe, belated in his feeding, ran along the sandy shore, uttering his tweet tweet and his little cry, breaking in so softly on the silence, seemed only to make more deeply felt the great vast stillness of the night. Joe's arm was around Nell. She had demurred at first, but he gave no heed to her slight resistance, and finally her head rested against his shoulder. There was no need of words. Joe had a pleasurable sense of her nearness, and there was a delight in the fragrance of her hair as it waved against his cheek. But just then love was not uppermost in his mind. All day he had been silent under the force of an emotion which he could not analyze. Some power, some feeling, in which the thought of Nell had no share, was drawing him with irresistible strength. Nell had just begun to surrender to him in the sweetness of her passion, and yet, even with that knowledge knocking reproachfully at his heart, he could not help being absorbed in the shimmering water and the dark reflection of the trees, the gloom and shadow of the forest. Presently he felt her form relax in his arms. Then her soft, regular breathing told him she had fallen asleep, and he laughed low to himself. How she would pout on the morrow when he teased her about it! Then, realizing that she was tired with her long day's journey, he reproached himself for keeping her from the needed rest, and instantly decided to carry her to the raft. Yet such was the novelty of the situation that he yielded to its charm, and did not go at once. The moonlight found bright threads in her wavy hair. It shone caressingly on her quiet face, and tried to steal under the downcast lashes. Joe made a movement to rise with her, when she muttered indistinctly, as if speaking to someone. He remembered then she had once told him that she talked in her sleep, and how greatly it annoyed her. He might hear something more with which to tease her, so he listened. "Yes, uncle, I will go. Kate, we must go." Another interval of silence, then more murmurings. He distinguished his own name, and presently she called clearly, as if answering some inward questioner. "I love him. Yes, I love Joe. He has mastered me. Yet I wish he were like Jem. Jem, who looked at me so, with his deep eyes, and I—" Joe lifted her as if she were a baby, and carrying her down to the raft, gently laid her by her sleeping sister. The innocent words which she should not have heard were like a blow. What she would never have acknowledged in her waking hours had been revealed in her dreams. He recalled the glance of Jim's eyes, as it had rested on Nell many times that day, and now these things were most significant. He found at the end of the island a great mossy stone. On this he climbed, and sat where the moonlight streamed upon him. Gradually that cold bitterness died out from his face as it passed from his heart, and once more he became engrossed in the silver sheen on the water, the lapping of the waves on the pebbly beach, and in that speaking, mysterious silence of the woods. When the first faint rays of red streaked over the eastern hilltops, and the river mist rose from the water in a vapory cloud, Jeff Lynn rolled out of his blanket, stretched his long limbs, and gave a hearty call to the morning. His cheerful welcome awakened all the voyagers except Joe, who had spent the night in watching and the early morning in fishing. "Well, I'll be darned!" ejaculated Jeff as he saw Joe. "Up before me, and ketched a string of fish." "What are they?" asked Joe, holding up several bronze-backed fish. "Bass, black bass, and that big feller is a lammin' hefty 'un. How'd you catch 'em?" "I fished for them." "Well, so it appears," growled Jeff, once more reluctantly yielding to his admiration for the lad. "How'd you wake up so early?" "I stayed up all night. I saw 3 deer swim from the mainland, but nothing else came around." "Try your hand at cleanin' 'em for breakfast," continued Jeff, beginning to busy himself with preparations for that meal. "Well, well, if he ain't surprisin'. He'll do somethin' out here on the frontier, sure as I'm a born sinner," he muttered to himself, wagging his head in his quaint manner. Breakfast over, Jeff transferred the horses to the smaller raft which he had cut loose from his own, and giving a few directions to Bill, started downstream with Mr. Wells and the girls. The rafts remained close together for a while, but as the current quickened and was more skillfully taken advantage of by Jeff, the larger raft gained considerable headway, gradually widening the gap between the two. All day they drifted. From time to time Joe and Jim waved their hands to the girls, but the greater portion of their attention was given to quieting the horses. Mose, Joe's big white dog, retired in disgust to the hut, where he watched and dozed by turns. He did not fancy this kind of voyaging. Bill strained his sturdy arms all day on the steering oar. About the middle of the afternoon Joe observed that the hills grew more rugged and precipitous, and the river ran faster. He kept a constant lookout for the wall of rock which marked the point of danger. When the sun had disappeared behind the hills, he saw ahead a gray rock protruding from the green foliage. It was ponderous, overhanging, and seemed to frown down on the river. This was Shawnee Rock. Joe looked long at the cliff, and wondered if there was now an Indian scout hidden behind the pines that skirted the edge. Prominent on the top of the bluff, a large dead tree projected its hoary, twisted branches. Bill evidently saw the landmark, for he stopped in his monotonous walk to and fro across the raft, and pushing his oar amidships, he looked ahead for the other raft. The figure of the tall frontiersman could be plainly seen as he labored at the helm. The raft disappeared round a bend, and as it did so, Joe saw a white scarf waved by Nell. Bill worked the clumsy craft over toward the right shore, where the current was more rapid. He pushed with all his strength, and when the oar had reached its widest sweep, he lifted it and ran back across the raft for another push. Joe scanned the river ahead. He saw no rapids, only rougher water whirling over some rocks. They were where the channel narrowed and ran close to the right-hand bank. Under a willow-flanked ledge was a sandbar. To Joe there seemed nothing hazardous in drifting through this pass. "Bad place ahead," said Bill, observing Joe's survey of the river. "It doesn't look so," replied Joe. "A raft ain't a boat. We could pole a boat. You has to have water to float logs, and the river's run out considerable. I'm only feared for the horses. If we hit or drag, they might plunge around a bit." When the raft passed into the head of the bend, it struck the rocks several times, but finally gained the channel safely, and everything seemed propitious for an easy passage. But greatly to Bill's surprise, the wide craft was caught directly in the channel and swung round so that the steering oar pointed toward the opposite shore. The water roared a foot deep over the logs. "Hold hard on the horses!" yelled Bill. "Something's wrong. I never seen a snag there." The straining mass of logs, insecurely fastened together, rolled and then pitched loose again, but the short delay had been fatal to the steering apparatus. Joe would have found keen enjoyment in the situation had it not been for his horse Lance. The thoroughbred was difficult to hold. As Bill was making strenuous efforts to get in a lucky stroke with the oar, he failed to see a long length of grapevine floating like a brown snake of the water below. In the excitement they heeded not the barking of Mose, nor did they see the grapevine straighten and become taut just as they drifted upon it, but they felt the raft strike and hold on some submerged object. It creaked and groaned, and the foamy waters surged, gurgling, between the logs. Jim's mare snorted with terror, and rearing high, pulled her halter loose and plunged into the river. But Jim still held her, at risk of being drawn overboard. "Let go! She'll drag you in!" yelled Joe, grasping him with his free hand. Lance trembled violently and strained at the rope, which his master held with a strong grip. Crack! The stinging report of a rifle rang out above the splashing of the water. Without a cry, Bill's grasp on the oar loosened. He fell over it limply, his head striking the almost submerged log. A dark red fluid colored the water. Then his body slipped over the oar and into the river, where it sank. "My God! Shot!" cried Jim in horrified tones. He saw a puff of white smoke rising above the willows. Then the branches parted, revealing the dark forms of several Indian warriors. From the rifle in the foremost savage's hand a slight veil of smoke rose. With the leap of a panther, the redskin sprang from the strip of sand to the raft. "Hold, Jim! Drop that axe! We're caught!" cried Joe. "It's that Indian from the fort!" gasped Jim. The stalwart warrior was indeed Silvertip, but how changed! Stripped of the blanket he had worn at the settlement, now standing naked but for his buckskin breechcloth, with his perfectly proportioned form disclosed in all its sinewy beauty, and on his swarthy, evil face an expression of savage scorn, he surely looked a warrior and a chief. He drew his tomahawk and flashed a dark glance at Joe. For a moment he steadily regarded the young man. But if he expected to see fear in the latter's face, he was mistaken, for the look was returned coolly. "Paleface steal shirt," he said in his deep voice. "Fool paleface play. Silvertip no forget." End of Chapter 4 of The Spirit of the Border by Zane Grey. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. Chapter 5 of The Spirit of the Border by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 5. Silvertip turned to his braves, and giving a brief command, sprang from the raft. The warriors closed in around the brothers, two grasping each by the arms, and the remaining Indian taking care of the horse. The captives were then led ashore, where Silvertip awaited them. When the horse was clear of the raft, which task necessitated considerable labor on the part of the Indians, the chief seized the grapevine that was now plainly in sight, and severed it with one blow of his tomahawk. The raft dashed forward with a lurch and drifted downstream. In the clear water Joe could see the cunning trap which had caused the death of Bill and ensured the captivity of himself and his brother. The crafty savages had trimmed a 6-inch sapling and anchored it under the water. They weighted the heavy end, leaving the other pointing upstream. To this last had been tied the grapevine. When the drifting raft reached the sapling, the Indians concealed in the willows pulled hard on the improvised rope. The end of the sapling stuck up like a hook, and the aft was caught and held. The killing of the helmsman showed the Indians' foresight. Even had the raft drifted on downstream, the brothers would have been helpless on a craft they could not manage. After all, Joe thought, he had not been so far wrong when he half fancied that an Indian lay behind Shawnee Rock, and he marveled at this clever trick which had so easily effected their capture. But he had little time to look around at the scene of action. There was a moment only in which to study the river to learn if the unfortunate raftsman's body had appeared. It was not to be seen. The river ran swiftly and hid all evidence of the tragedy under its smooth surface. When the brave who had gone back to the raft for the goods joined his companion, the two hurried Joe up the bank after the others. Once upon level ground, Joe saw before him an open forest. On the border of this the Indians stopped long enough to bind their prisoners' wrists with thongs of deer-hide. While two of the braves performed this office, Silvertip leaned against a tree and took no notice of the brothers. When they were thus securely tied, one of their captors addressed the chief, who at once led the way westward through the forest. The savages followed in single file, with Joe and Jim in the middle of the line. The last Indian tried to mount Lance, but the thoroughbred would have none of him, and after several efforts the savage was compelled to desist. Mose trotted reluctantly along behind the horse. Although the chief preserved a dignified mien, his braves were disposed to be gay. They were in high glee over their feat of capturing the palefaces, and kept up an incessant jabbering. One Indian, who walked directly behind Joe, continually prodded him with the stock of a rifle, and whenever Joe turned, the brawny redskin grinned as he grunted, "Ugh." Joe observed that this huge savage had a broad face of rather a lighter shade of red than his companions. Perhaps he intended those rifle prods in friendliness, for although they certainly amused him, he would allow no one else to touch Joe. But it would have been more pleasing had he shown his friendship in a gentle manner. This Indian carried Joe's pack, much to his own delight, especially as his companions evinced an envious curiosity. The big fellow would not, however, allow them to touch it. "He's a cheerful brute," remarked Joe to Jim. Grunted the big Indian, jamming Joe with his rifle stock. Joe took heed to the warning and spoke no more. He gave all his attention to the course over which he was being taken. Here was his first opportunity to learn something of Indians and their woodcraft. It occurred to him that his captors would not have been so gay and careless had they not believed themselves safe from pursuit, and he concluded that they were leisurely conducting him to one of the Indian towns. He watched the supple figure before him, wondering at the quick step, light as the fall of a leaf, and tried to walk as softly. He found, however, that where the Indian readily avoided the sticks and brush, he was unable to move without snapping twigs. Now and then he would look up and study the lay of the land ahead, and as he came nearer to certain rocks and trees, he scrutinized them closely in order to remember their shape and general appearance. He believed he was blazing out in his mind this woodland trail, so that should fortune favor him and he contrive to escape, he would be able to find his way back to the river. Also, he was enjoying the wild scenery. The forest would have appeared beautiful even to one indifferent to such charms, and Joe was far from that. Every moment he felt steal stronger over him a subtle influence which he could not define. Half unconsciously he tried to analyze it, but it baffled him. He could no more explain what fascinated him than he could understand what caused the melancholy quiet which hung over the glades and hollows. He had pictured a real forest so differently from this. Here was a long lane paved with springy moss and fenced by bright green sassafras. There a secluded dale, dotted with pale blue blossoms, over which the giant cottonwoods leaned their heads, jealously guarding the delicate flowers from the sun. Beech trees, growing close in clanny groups, spread their straight limbs gracefully. The white birches gleamed like silver wherever a stray sunbeam stole through the foliage, and the oaks, monarchs of the forest, rose over all, dark, rugged, and kingly. Joe soon understood why the party traveled through such open forest. The chief, seeming hardly to deviate from his direct course, kept clear of broken ground, matted thickets, and tangled windfalls. Joe got a glimpse of dark ravines and heard the music of tumbling waters. He saw gray cliffs grown over with vines and full of holes and crevices, steep ridges covered with dense patches of briar and hazel rising in the way. Yet the Shawnee always found an easy path. The sun went down behind the foliage in the west, and shadows appeared low in the glens. Then the trees faded into an indistinct mass. A purple shade settled down over the forest, and night brought the party to a halt. The Indians selected a sheltered spot under the lee of a knoll, at the base of which ran a little brook. Here in this enclosed space were the remains of a campfire. Evidently the Indians had halted there that same day, for the logs still smoldered. While one brave fanned the embers, another took from a neighboring branch a haunch of deer meat. A blaze was soon coaxed from the dull coals, more fuel was added, and presently a cheerful fire shone on the circle of dusky forms. It was a picture which Joe had seen in many a boyish dream. Now that he was a part of it, he did not dwell on the hopelessness of the situation, nor of the hostile chief whose enmity he had incurred. Almost, it seemed, he was glad of this chance to watch the Indians and listen to them. He had been kept apart from Jim, and it appeared to Joe that their captors treated his brother with a contempt which they did not show him. Silvertip had no doubt informed them that Jim had been on his way to teach the Indians of the white man's God. Jim sat with drooping head. His face was sad, and evidently he took the most disheartening view of his capture. When he had eaten the slice of venison given him, he lay down with his back to the fire. Silvertip, in these surroundings, showed his real character. He had appeared friendly in the settlement, but now he was the relentless savage, a son of the wilds, free as an eagle. His dignity as a chief kept him aloof from his braves. He had taken no notice of the prisoners since the capture. He remained silent, steadily regarding the fire with his somber eyes. At length, glancing at the big Indian, he motioned toward the prisoners, and with a single word stretched himself on the leaves. Joe noted the same changelessness of expression in the other dark faces as he had seen in Silvertip's. It struck him forcibly. When they spoke in their soft, guttural tones, or burst into a low, not unmusical laughter, or sat gazing stolidly into the fire, their faces seemed always the same, inscrutable, like the depths of the forest now hidden in night. One thing Joe felt rather than saw: these savages were fierce and untamable. He was sorry for Jim, because, as he believed, it would be as easy to teach the panther gentleness toward his prey as to instill into one of these wild creatures a belief in Christ. The braves manifested keen pleasure in anticipation as to what they would get out of the pack, which the Indian now opened. Time and again the big brave placed his broad hand on the shoulder of a comrade Indian and pushed him backward. Finally the pack was opened. It contained a few articles of wearing apparel, a pair of boots and a pipe and pouch of tobacco. The big Indian kept the latter articles, grunting with satisfaction, and threw the boots and clothes to the others. Immediately there was a scramble. One brave, after a struggle with another, got possession of both boots. He at once slipped off his moccasins and drew on the white man's foot coverings. He strutted around in them a few moments, but his proud manner soon changed to disgust. Cowhide had none of the soft, yielding qualities of buckskin, and hurt the Indian's feet. Sitting down, he pulled one off, not without difficulty, for the boots were wet, but he could not remove the other. He hesitated a moment, being aware of the subdued merriment of his comrades, and then held up his foot to the nearest one. This chanced to be the big Indian, who evidently had a keen sense of humor. Taking hold of the boot with both hands, he dragged the luckless brave entirely around the campfire. The fun, however, was not to be all one-sided. The big Indian gave a more strenuous pull, and the boot came off suddenly. Unprepared for this, he lost his balance and fell down the bank almost into the creek. He held on to the boot, nevertheless, and getting up, threw it into the fire. The braves quieted down after that, and soon lapsed into slumber, leaving the big fellow, to whom the chief had addressed his brief command, acting as guard. Observing Joe watching him as he puffed on his new pipe, he grinned, and spoke in broken English that was intelligible, and much of a surprise to the young man. "Paleface, tobacco, heap good." Then, seeing that Joe made no effort to follow his brother's initiative, for Jim was fast asleep, he pointed to the recumbent figures and spoke again. Paleface sleep. Injun wigwams near setting sun." On the following morning Joe was awakened by the pain in his legs, which had been bound all night. He was glad when the bonds were cut, and the party took up its westward march. The Indians, though somewhat quieter, displayed the same carelessness. They did not hurry nor use particular caution, but selected the most open paths through the forest. They even halted while one of their number crept up on a herd of browsing deer. About noon the leader stopped to drink from a spring. His braves followed suit, and permitted the white prisoners to quench their thirst. When they were about to start again, the single note of a bird far away in the woods sounded clearly on the quiet air. Joe would not have given heed to it had he been less attentive. He instantly associated this peculiar bird note with the sudden stiffening of Silvertip's body and his attitude of intense listening. Low exclamations came from the braves as they bent to catch the lightest sound. Presently, above the murmur of the gentle fall of water over the stones, rose that musical note once more. It was made by a bird, Joe thought, and yet, judged by the actions of the Indians, how potent with meaning beyond that of the simple melody of the woodland songster. He turned, half expecting to see somewhere in the tree tops the bird which had wrought so sudden a change in his captors. As he did so, from close at hand came the same call, now louder, but identical with the one that had deceived him. It was an answering signal, and had been given by Silvertip. It flashed into Joe's mind that other savages were in the forest. They had run across the Shawnees' trail, and were thus communicating with them. Soon dark figures could be discerned against the patches of green thicket. They came nearer and nearer, and now entered the open glade where Silvertip stood with his warriors. Joe counted 12, and noted that they differed from his captors. He had only time to see that this difference consisted in the headdress and in the color and quantity of paint on their bodies, when his gaze was attracted and riveted to the foremost figures. The first was that of a very tall and stately chief, toward whom Silvertip now advanced with every show of respect. In this Indian's commanding stature, in his reddish bronze face, stern and powerful, there were readable the characteristics of a king. In his deep-set eyes, gleaming from under a ponderous brow, in his mastiff-like jaw, in every feature of his haughty face were visible all the high intelligence, the consciousness of past valor, and the power and authority that denote a great chieftain. The second figure was equally striking for the remarkable contrast it afforded to the chief's. Despite the gaudy garments, the paint, the fringed and beaded buckskin leggins, all the Indian accouterments and garments which bedecked this person, he would have been known anywhere as a white man. His skin was burned to a dark bronze, but it had not the red tinge which characterizes the Indian. The white man had indeed a strange physiognomy. The forehead was narrow and sloped backward from the brow, denoting animal instincts. The eyes were close together, yellowish brown in color, and had a peculiar vibrating movement, as though they were hung on a pivot like a compass needle. The nose was long and hooked, and the mouth set in a thin, cruel line. There was in the man's aspect an extraordinary combination of ignorance, vanity, cunning, and ferocity. While the two chiefs held a short consultation, this savage-appearing white man addressed the brothers. "Where are you, and where are you going?" he asked gruffly, confronting Jim. "My name is Downs. I am a preacher, and was on my way to the Moravian mission to preach to the Indians. You are a white man. Will you help us?" If Jim expected the information would please his interrogator, he was mistaken. "So you're one of them. Yes, I'll do something for you when I get back from this hunt. I'll cut your heart out, chop it up, and feed it to the buzzards," he said fiercely, concluding his threat by striking Jim a cruel blow on the head. Joe paled deathly white at this cowardly action, and his eyes, as they met the gaze of the ruffian, contracted with their characteristic steely glow, as if some powerful force within the depths of his being were at white heat, and only this pale flash came to the surface. "You ain't a preacher?" questioned the man, meeting something in Joe's glance that had been absent from Jim's. Joe made no answer, and regarded the questioner steadily. "Ever seen me before? Ever hear of Jim Girty?" he asked boastfully. "Before you spoke, I knew you were Girty," answered Joe quietly. "How do you know? Ain't you afeared?" "Of what?" Me." Joe laughed in the renegade's face. "How'd you know me?" growled Girty. "I'll see that you have cause to remember me after this." "I figured there was only one so-called white man in these woods who is coward enough to strike a man whose hands are tied." "Boy, you're too free with your tongue. I'll shut off your wind. Girty's hand was raised, but it never reached Joe's neck. The big Indian had an hour or more previous cut Joe's bonds, but he still retained the thong which was left attached to Joe's left wrist. This allowed the young man free use of his right arm, which, badly swollen or not, he brought into quick action. When the renegade reached toward him, Joe knocked up the hand, and instead of striking, he grasped the hooked nose with all the powerful grip of his fingers. Girty uttered a frightful curse. He writhed with pain, but could not free himself from the vice-like clutch. He drew his tomahawk, and with a scream aimed a vicious blow at Joe. He missed his aim, however, for Silvertip had intervened and turned the course of the keen hatchet. But the weapon struck Joe a glancing blow, inflicting a painful, though not dangerous wound. The renegade's nose was skinned and bleeding profusely. He was frantic with fury and tried to get at Joe, but Silvertip remained in front of his captive until some of the braves led Girty into the forest, where the tall chief had already disappeared. The nose-pulling incident added to the gaiety of the Shawnees, who evidently were pleased with Girty's discomfiture. They jabbered among themselves and nodded approvingly at Joe, until a few words spoken by Silvertip produced a sudden change. What the words were, Joe could not understand, but to him they sounded like French. He smiled at the absurdity of imagining he had heard a savage speak a foreign language. At any rate, whatever had been said was trenchant with meaning. The Indians changed from gay to grave. They picked up their weapons and looked keenly on every side. The big Indian at once retied Joe, and then all crowded round the chief. "Did you hear what Silvertip said, and did you notice the effect it had?" whispered Jim, taking advantage of the moment. "It sounded like French, but of course it wasn't," replied Joe. "It was French. Le vent de la mort." "By Jove, that's it. What does it mean?" asked Joe, who was not a scholar. "The wind of death." "That's English, but I can't apply it here. Can you?" "No doubt it is some Indian omen." The hurried consultation over, Silvertip tied Joe's horse and dog to the trees, and once more led the way. This time he avoided the open forest and kept on low ground. For a long time he traveled in the bed of the brook, wading when the water was shallow, and always stepping where there was the least possibility of leaving a footprint. Not a word was spoken. If either of the brothers made the lightest splash in the water or tumbled a stone into the brook, the Indian behind rapped him on the head with the tomahawk handle. At certain places, indicated by the care which Silvertip exercised in walking, the Indian in front of the captives turned and pointed where they were to step. They were hiding the trail. Silvertip hurried them over the stony places, went more slowly through the water, and picked his way carefully over the soft ground it became necessary to cross. At times he stopped, remaining motionless many seconds. The vigilance continued all the afternoon. The sun sank, twilight spread its gray mantle, and soon black night enveloped the forest. The Indians halted, but made no fire. They sat close together on a stony ridge, silent and watchful. Joe pondered deeply over this behavior. Did the Shawnees fear pursuit? What had that Indian chief told Silvertip? To Joe it seemed they acted as if believing foes were on all sides. Though they hid their tracks, it was apparently not the fear of pursuit alone which made them cautious. Joe reviewed the afternoon's march and dwelt upon the possible meaning of the cat-like steps, the careful brushing aside of branches, the roving eyes, suspicious and gloomy, the eager watchfulness of the advance as well as to the rear, and always the strained effort to listen, all of which gave him the impression of some grave, unseen danger. And now, as he lay on the hard ground, nearly exhausted by the long march and suffering from the throbbing wound, his courage lessened somewhat, and he shivered with dread. The quiet and gloom of the forest, these fierce wild creatures, free in the heart of their own wilderness, yet menaced by a foe, and that strange French phrase which kept recurring in his mind. All had the effect of conjuring up giant shadows in Joe's fanciful mind. During all his life, until this moment, he had never feared anything. Now he was afraid of the darkness. The spectral trees spread long arms overhead, and phantom forms stalked abroad. Somewhere out in that dense gloom stirred this mysterious foe, the wind of death. Nevertheless, he finally slept. In the dull gray light of early morning, the Indians once more took up the line of march toward the west. They marched all that day, and at dark halted to eat and rest. Silvertip and another Indian stood watch. Some time before morning Joe suddenly awoke. The night was dark, yet it was lighter than when he had fallen asleep. A pale crescent moon shone dimly through the murky clouds. There was neither movement of the air nor the chirp of an insect. Absolute silence prevailed. Joe saw the Indian guard leaning against a tree, asleep. Silvertip was gone. The captive raised his head and looked around for the chief. There were only 4 Indians left, 3 on the ground and 1 against the tree. He saw something shining near him. He looked more closely and made out the object to be an eagle plume Silvertip had worn in his headdress. It lay on the ground near the tree. Joe made some slight noise which awakened the guard. The Indian never moved a muscle, but his eyes roved everywhere. He, too, noticed the absence of the chief. At this moment, from out of the depths of the woods, came a swelling sigh, like the moan of the night wind. It rose and died away, leaving the silence apparently all the deeper. A shudder ran over Joe's frame. Fascinated, he watched the guard. The Indian uttered a low gasp. His eyes started and glared wildly. He rose very slowly to his full height and stood waiting, listening. The dark hand which held the tomahawk trembled, so that little glints of moonlight glanced from the bright steel. From far back in the forest deeps came that low moaning, "Um-oo." It rose from a faint murmur and swelled to a deep moan, soft but clear, and ended in a wail like that of a lost soul. The break it made in that dead silence was awful. Joe's blood seemed to have curdled and frozen. A cold sweat oozed from his skin, and it was as if a clammy hand clutched at his heart. He tried to persuade himself that the fear displayed by the savage was only superstition, and that moan was but the sigh of the night wind. The Indian sentinel stood as if paralyzed an instant after that weird cry, and then, swift as a flash and as noiseless, he was gone into the gloomy forest. He had fled without awakening his companions. Once more the moaning cry arose and swelled mournfully on the still night air. It was close at hand. "The wind of death," whispered Joe. He was shaken and unnerved by the events of the past 2 days, and dazed from his wound. His strength deserted him, and he lost consciousness. End of Chapter 5 of The Spirit of the Border by Zane Grey. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio.